everyone, I'm Sostine and welcome to my channel. First off, I want to say thank you so much.
It's here.
I've been on YouTube now for 4 years and I'm just so honored and proud to say that I just hit 100,000 viewers and it's all thanks to you. It's so incredibly humbling to know that you guys have made this happen for me for the last 4 years. I just got my play button and I've been working on it for so long that I couldn't even believe it. So thank you. With that said, let's get to today's video. Last episode on Sostine, we're going to be making an 1898 Worth gown inspired gown for the incomparably fierce Queen Astraea for her to wear to a ball in France.
Holy shit, that is me! What the fuck? Just wait till you see it with the bodice.
In today's video, we're going to be finishing off the Edwardian Ballgown by making the bodice. This gown is an amalgamation of 3 different Worth gowns: the shape of the pink wheat embroidery one, the bottom of the celestial gown, and the placement of the embroidery that was inspired by the butterfly one. This is all combined with Astraea's love of celestial bodies and stars, and all the embroidery was of course done with stars. There's also a cloud motif because it's beautiful. Astraea and I assumed that Worth's original gown was inspired by the auspicious clouds that are so popular in Asian embroidery. So Astraea designed the clouds to look very much like the ones in traditional Asian art, such as those on Korean rank badges called hyungbae. The skirt came easily to us, but the ideas for the bodice were less so. Astraea and I must have looked at about 50 different bodices for this gown. The problem being is that we didn't love any of the bodices on the original 3 gowns we used as inspiration. And this got me wondering, is the key to Worth's gowns the skirt and not the tops? I don't have an answer. Astraea and I sent each other ideas for tops one after the other, back and forth, sketches going here, sketches going there. But regardless of what design we chose, the steps are all the same and the shape is generally the same. So I started on the bodice even before we came to a final design. In the year that these dresses came out, we're talking 1901 to 1905, the S-bend corset was very much in fashion. Astraea had such a corset made for her by Red Threaded, who is of course run by Cynthia Seche, who probably made the single most famous Worth gown reproduction in the historical costuming community. And the lovely thing about Red Threaded is that they always get their shapes just right. S-bend corset, so named for its shape, was thought to be healthier for women. As a doctor, I'm not really sure why. To be clear, I don't think corsets themselves are particularly dangerous unless you do something dangerous with them, any more than our bras or any form of back support. But neither can I think of any particular reason that this shape would be more helpful. One thing I do love is that this corset does give outfits from this era a very particular and distinct shape of the pigeon bust. Now, the ball gowns of this era are all very similar and it follows a very particular formula. A closely fit bodice that stops precisely at the waist, either with a belt or a V-shaped front. The sleeves are varied and the decorations are also varied, but they all have frothy lace, flowers, and overall just lovely over-the-top decorations. I want to say that this is the era of the cold shoulder, and I'm delighted to say that it's been making a comeback. I'm talking about the gown that has the bodice, the strap, but also a sleeve that doesn't quite cover the shoulder. It's not just a modern idea, but one that the Edwardians are quite fond of, and you see quite a bit. So while I had no idea how I would decorate the bodice, I did know what shape it would be and how it would be put on. So I started by making a mock-up to get the shape and size just right. To my knowledge, there is no good commercially available pattern for a 1901 to 1905 ball gown bodice. If you know of one, let me know. However, this is for Astraea, and since I don't have a perfect replica of her corseted torso the way I do for myself, I decided to do other method that I use. I got an 1880s bodice pattern from Truly Victorian. This one is meant for an hourglass figure, while Worth gowns from this era are clearly designed for the S-bend corseted figure. However, if I make the pattern slightly larger than expected for Astraea and then take it down for her while she's wearing the corset, I knew I could still get it to fit. So that's what I did. I started with a mock-up. Now for bodices, I like to make the mock-up in a slightly sturdier fabric than just cotton muslin, since muslin can stretch and warp. With this in mind, I use cotton twill. I bought this with me when I went to New York City for the photo shoot in Central Park that I did with Astraea and a bunch of other friends. There, while I was fitting the skirt, I also fitted the top on top of her. The key to a good fitting bodice is to start with a mock-up that is approximately the right size or just slightly larger, since it's easier to make things smaller than bigger. Make sure not to iron open the seams. If the person is mostly symmetrical, I like to put the garment on wrong side out and then start pinching in the seams so that everything lines up just so, while following the curves of said person. Be sure to line up the mock-up so that the back seam is midline on their back and the side seams are actually on the side and the front seam is actually in the front, and then use the rest for guidance. I also made a note of where the center front is on the front. I use a pencil, or in this case a highlighter, draw in all the seams and then mark it with pins. I also made a point of drawing in the corset line so I'd know where the corset was supposed to fall on her and could be sure that the bodice went over that. I also drew in where the waistline was and added in the point in the front. I did attempt to draw in the bodice design and all ideas were scrapped, so ignore all that stuff. But once I was back home in Chicago with a mock-up, I started on the structure. Original Worth gown bodices are usually made of polished cotton or silk taffeta on the inside. I wanted to give mine more structure since I wanted the bodice itself to act as my muslin and my dress form. This was a decision made on two principles. One, since I don't have a dress form to fit this on, I wanted to be able to put it on a pillow and have it hold its own shape so it could be its own dress form while I worked on it. Secondly, if Astraea ever wanted to wear it without a corset, this bonnet would be its own corset. For that reason, I made it out of cotton coutil, which, if you don't know, is the material that actual corsets are made of. So I cut out the pieces, adjusting them as I marked, adding in a 1/2 inch seam allowance where needed, and then started sewing the coutil together. If you look at the inside of Worth gowns, they are messy. No finished, pretty satin lining like modern couture gowns. And I'm okay with this since the gown will be worn on top of a corset anyway and it won't chafe. And really, this way I also get to see the construction, which is like the best part. You'll notice that there is boning everywhere too. So I started putting in boning on all the seams as well. Now this was done by using some cotton tape and sewing it down with a 3/8 inch gap in between for the boning. I also added boning to the center front by creating a channel in the fold of the fabric. At this point, Astraea and I had a plan for the dress. Night leak. I need you to stop snoring. By this point, Astraea and I decided to make the dress strapless. We might add sleeves later, but weren't sure. But we did know that we'd add some drapey bits to an otherwise strapless base, so I went ahead and cut off the straps in the shape that I wanted the bodice to be. I also hemmed the top and bottom of the coutil base at this time. Once that was done, I sewed in the hooks and eyes. The bodice was now at a point where it could hold its own shape on its own, so I used my son's The Jungle Skog as a model. However, the Jungle Skog is actually much bigger on his bottom than his bust, so sadly he had to wear the bodice upside down in order to get the conical shape needed for the 1901 fashion, which is so fashionable at this time. But once the bodice was on, he was plushy enough that I could actually drape the pieces to cover the base. I used cotton muslin on the bias so that I could have stretch to go across the bodice and made all the pieces that I would need. I decided it would be kind of like a wrap dress in the front as well as the back, so this was 4 pieces. The way that the bodice will close is actually in the front to make putting on the bodice as easy as possible. This way it'll close by clipping up the front with hooks and eyes, and then the ugly front pieces will be hidden by the wrap portion. You can see that this was done in other Worth bodices as well from this era and actually works really well. You'll notice that this section over here is actually the center back, not the front, and the center front is actually here and here. I started adding in the silk fabric to cover up all the coutil. You'll notice I did this by ironing down the seam allowance on the silk pieces and then sewing them onto the right side of the coutil, the wrong side of the silk down, leaving the ugly boned part on the inside still visible. This is to give the silk satin layer as flat a base to lie on as possible. Once the pieces were pinned on, I sewed on each piece layer by layer using hand sewing. I took some of the lace that I'd used on Astraea's skirt and pleated it up so that it looked just nice, and then stitched that down as well so that the whole dress would be tied together. By this time, Astraea and I had finally come up with a design for the bodice that we loved. Please note that we had no idea what the sleeves or the straps were going to look like at this point, but I proceeded with the bodice. Once this was drawn out, I scanned it into the computer and digitized it. And by digitize, I mean adding all the stars. The initial bodice came out looking like this, and honestly, I hated it. So I thought it'd be cool if I took the idea and just use it off as a jumping off point. Astraea had sent me some pictures of some stars that she liked, and I love the idea of the explosion of stars, or the star with a long comet of lines and other stars. I got some silk organza and embroidered the design onto it around 14 by 28 inches, and then pleated up the silk so that it would actually have this feeling, but in pleated silk. I initially tried silk gauze, but it turned out to be too fragile, and I loved how this came out. But I didn't like how the pleats just covered up a lot of the stars so that all the stars were partly obscured. To remedy this, I cut out the bottom half of each star, the part that was covered up by the pleats, and pulled it over the fold and over the pleat so it stuck out on top. And then each pleat was individually sewn down, the stars stitched on top of the pleated organza one at a time until each one was completely put in the right place. This was extremely time consuming, around 8 hours of hand sewing just for this portion, but it was well worth it. Once the bodice was otherwise done, I of course hand stitched the Sew Scene logo in there. I made it big so that no one could ignore me. Now the bodice was completely done. But the truth is, I wanted Astraea to have a little sewing kit to take with her, a dress repair kit of sorts. I also wanted her to have the materials that she would need to sew in the straps, which she agreed to do herself, since I have no idea what her dimensions were. Now, to do this, I decided to make her a mini Huswife or housewife, which is an 18th century sewing kit. I do have a whole video about the history of these sewing kits and the making of mine. However, I do find mine to be a little bulky when traveling, and it doesn't really fit into my smaller purses or pockets. And I'd long been designing this teeny tiny version. I wanted to make Astraea one with the same materials as her gown so that it would match. So after digitizing this, I stitched it out. I cut out the pieces and put the top of that around some cotton batting as well as another silk piece. I added on a piece of lace to the interior to reflect the lace on the dress. I then stitched up all the layers together and then cleaned up the edges. I got some silk tape that I'd cut and then started pinning it around the border as so. The silk tape is 1.5 inches wide, by the way. At each corner, I first folded the silk tape at a 45-degree angle and then at 90-degree angle. And again, this will give me deliciously easy mitered corners. Just be sure to stitch a seam 3/8 of an inch away from the edge and then 1/2 inch away from the corner to about 1/2 inch away from the other corner on all 4 sides. Then remove the pins and just turn. You have perfect mitered corners. Then you sewed all the sides down with hand sewing on the opposite side and then add in all the details you want after you choose. I chose to put in a little piece of wool for pins and needles, a little pocket for thread, wax, and a thimble, and some elastic to hold a pair of sewing scissors that are even TSA safe. Finally, I added a snap to close it with. And there you go, a matching little sewing kit to use as a repair kit. I tucked this into a box along with the skirt, the bodice, some trim to use as straps, as well as extra stars to hot glue onto whatever she wants to wear along with a note. This package did get lost for a few days along the way, but I was so relieved to see that it got to Queen Astraea safely. She wore it to the ball and looked absolutely incredible. I'm just so honored to see her wearing it, and I really had so much fun collaborating with her on it. Like, sewing with friends is the best way to sew. Thank you so much for watching this, and I'll see you in May with a new video. My next project that I'm currently working on is the making of the bee gown by Duchess. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and don't forget the bell.